Now. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world right now. I'm thankful that you joined here today for this exciting webinar on understanding well-being. We are happy to have you all here, and I hope you'll enjoy today's session. I would like to briefly introduce myself. I'm Daniela Anna. I'm a social anthropologist, and I work as a postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Institute for Agricultural Development and Transition Economies, located in Halle Saale in Germany. I'm part of the Leibniz Junior Research Group RuWell, which stands for Rural Wellbeing in Transition Economies, Multidimensional Drivers and Effects on Immobility. And this is funded by the Leibniz Association for 5 years in total. The project started last year. Its main objective is to develop a multidimensional well-being index with a special focus on place attachment. We then plan to link this index to immobility decisions for rural populations in rural East Germany and Southeast Europe. With this, we seek to generate policy salient research findings that hopefully will shape public discourse on quality of life in rural areas. We created this webinar series to have the opportunity to share, discuss, and get inspired by other scholars with experience in researching well-being from different disciplines. So I'm truly excited for our session today, which is the last in the webinar series, where Ted Fischer will hold his lecture named Understanding Well-being, Anthropological Insights and Economic Measures. Before I introduce Ted, I would like to encourage you to actively participate throughout the webinar, and you can ask questions and share your thoughts by using the chat feature on Zoom. We will address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session after the presentation. And you can raise your virtual hand by asking, by unmuting yourself. And if you want, you can switch on your camera. This can be nice. And Ted will talk for about 40 minutes. And after this, we will have time to discuss for, we'll see, around 20 minutes or longer. So I'd like to introduce Edward, or Ted Fischer. He's the Cornelius Vanderbilt Professor of Anthropology and Professor of Management and Health Policy at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. He directs the cultural context of health and well-being initiative and advises the World Health Organization on behavioral and cultural insights. His research focuses on issues of political economy, values, well-being, and development. He carried out extensive fieldwork in Guatemala and Germany, among other places, and he has authored or edited a number of books, including The Good Life, Aspiration, Dignity, and the Anthropology of Well-being, published in 2014. And his new book named Making Better Coffee, How Maya Farmers and Third Wave Tastemakers Create Value, was published with the University of California Press in September last year. I highly recommend the readings. And Ted, thank you so much for being here today and giving us insights into your research. And I'm delighted to give you the floor now.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I'm really excited to be here. And thank you and Anja and the whole, and I didn't know how it was pronounced. I was pronouncing it sort of, and I like the English, RuWell, but it's RuWell. I think you could go either way on that.
That's great. Are you well? It's great, actually. This will have a long life.
It's a real treat to be here. I'm an anthropologist, as Daniela was saying, and that's I think that's the reason I was asked to be here. I'm an anthropologist who's worked a long time with economists, and I was asked to sort of speak about that nexus, which is not as easy as it first sounds. I think we celebrate interdisciplinary work and collaborations, but the practicality of it is often really hard. It's not just learning another vocabulary, but really other epistemological positions, right? And trying to find a middle ground between those. And finding that middle ground always means making compromises, especially in the policy world where you all are working. So I'm going to offer, and I will offer some critiques of measurements of well-being, but that in the context of recognizing that it's important that we have these measures. And I guess sort of like Einstein famously said, right, that science isn't about getting it right, it's about getting it less wrong. And we're always trying to get it less wrong. So no measure is right. I'm going to argue, but we have ways of approaching these that are less wrong. I enjoyed the other talks in the sessions, and I will build on those a little bit. Talita and Kuhn's talks. My talk today is going to be a bit more theoretical or conceptual than empirical, in contrast to the other two talks. I'm not going to offer you any solutions. I'm not going to offer you any easy, hey, this is what you need to do when you're developing your multidimensional measure. But I'm going to, offer some questions that I hope would be interesting to think about as you are developing this work. As Daniela said, I'm a cultural anthropologist, but I work in the field of political economy. And I've worked with Mayan communities in Guatemala and supermarket consumers in Germany, and I will talk a little bit about that today. So economics and anthropology, economists and policymakers tend to look for aggregate measures, and it's necessary for making policy for large populations. While anthropologists tend to be more concentrated on context and subjective experience. Econ tends to focus on maximizing utility and figuring out how people pursue certain preferences. But for anthropologists, what is utility is the interesting question in that. What brings value to people's lives? And so the combination of these two, I think, can be incredibly productive, although as I intimated at the beginning, it's not as easy as it might first appear. So I'm going to share my screen and start the slideshow. Title of my talk. I wanted to start off talking about what is called the Latin American paradox. So for those of you who attended the other sessions, Talita's work on Twitter and happiness, and she was showing a pretty tight correlation between happiness and well-being. The Latin American example is a counter example to that. Of the, this is a couple of years old, my positive experiences worldwide list, but nonetheless, Latin America tends to be overrepresented in happiness indices. This year, it was 9 out of 10 countries were Latin American, including Guatemala. They're at number 3, and Mexico and Honduras and El Salvador. And yet these are some of the most violent places on earth. These are areas, and we could include Indonesia on this list as well, that suffer a lot. And so why are they so happy? They do score lower on life satisfaction indices, but still the question remains: why the disconnect here? Part of it is just the difference between happiness and well-being, right? How happy are you right now on a scale of 1 to 7 is a common survey question for that. In contrast, as you're all aware, the life satisfaction scales tend to be, looking over your life as a whole on a scale of 1 to 7, where would you put it from worst possible life to best possible life? Now, many of us, I think even we know this intuitively, there can be a difference between these, right? I mean, when I do this in large audiences and just have people raise their hands, I get much higher positives on the happiness scale than on the life satisfaction scale. It makes sense, as Talita was saying, we tend, our happiness tends to level out after big jumps or peaks or falls. But it also raises the question of, we were talking about Marx right before the session started, of false consciousness, right? Do people know when they're well off? Can there be a situation of bread and circuses where a system sort of satisfies people's hedonic needs enough that they don't agitate for larger structural change? And what does that mean when we're doing surveys about people's well-being? Do people know themselves what constitutes their well-being? As anthropologists, we tend to privilege what people themselves say. Now, again, as you know, some of this is going to be preaching to the choir, I realize, but sometimes the choir needs to be reminded as well. Income and GDP per capita were long used as a singular metric of poverty and conversely of well-being. And that makes a lot of sense in many ways, right? Having more material resources opens up a lot more choices. But we also realize, intuitively, and we have begun to realize theoretically, that poverty is more than a lack of income. It's shaped by social relations and political structures and cultural norms as much as market positions. And to label something as poverty, it's a moral call to action. The word itself sort of invokes a moral call to action, a recognition that the poor are deprived in ways that are deemed unjust. And embedded in that is a concern not just for material conditions, but for the suffering and unhappiness that goes along with a life in poverty. Now, multidimensional approaches to well-being have sought to address this, and I think rightly so. Our silos, our bounded domains, and I would say academically, conceptually, as well as in the policy realm, are a big hindrance to improving well-being. And yet, policymakers are always looking for the silver bullet. You know, what's the one thing that I can do to move the needle on the metric that we're trying to move? But the whole basis of a multidimensional approach is that there is no silver bullet, right? That it's complicated. Now, Amartya Sen, famously in his formulation of the capabilities approach to development, and his declaration that development should be seen as freedom, the freedom of individuals to effectively pursue what they themselves value. But of course, that raises the question of what do they value, right? And how does that change? Kuhn was getting at that yesterday in some very innovative ways. And I'm going to offer a more anthropological perspective of that. So based on Sen's work, we've come to realize that development is not just about GDP and income. And that we should be concerned not only with income poverty, but with creating circumstances for life satisfaction and integrative well-being. And again, that defies traditional disciplinary and policy boundaries. It also raises the issue of objective versus subjective measures. I started out with the two charts from Latin America, both based on subjective reporting of one's happiness or one's well-being. But of course, the multidimensional measures use a lot of objective metrics to create a composite. Now, again, economics is better at the objective quantitative measures. Anthropology is better at the subjective qualitative. But how do we put those together? Policy requires aggregate measurements. And so I guess the question, to reformulate that question, how do we capture parts of the subjective experience in our objective measures? And in doing that, I would say also, what is the role, and Kuhn touched on this yesterday, of changing what we might call aspirational horizons? What people want out of life changes over their life course, but it also in recent years has really changed based on social media exposure, right? What people want out of life is not just limited. Again, I've worked a long time in Mayan communities in Guatemala to an insular community somewhere. There's this larger range of references. So in terms of measuring well-being for policy, multidimensional measures, we have, Bhutan's gross national happiness, UNDP's HDI, and the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative's Multidimensional Poverty Index. And I'm going to talk about the last two today. So basic element, there's a pretty clear consensus in the well-being literature that there are some basic elements that need to be addressed for people to have well-being. I put here basic income in the sense that everyone doesn't need to be wealthy, and there's a lot of work coming out now re-looking at the relationship of income and well-being. But nonetheless, there needs to be at least an adequate income, and that's necessary but insufficient for overall well-being. Health and physical security, of course, if one is worried about dying, much less, little else matters. And social relationships, family, friends, networks of social relationships. In my work, I focused on some additional measures. These are not totally unique to me, but this is what emerged. I did a study comparing conceptions of well-being in Guatemala among Mayan communities, and in Germany, I was working with supermarket shoppers in Hanover, a middle-class neighborhood of Hanover. And those additional elements that emerged from that ethnographic research are aspiration and opportunity. And again, this is really building on Sen's work as well. People want to, having aspirations is important, but just as important is having a viable pathway to achieve those aspirations. Dignity and fairness, sort of being treated with respect and not being discriminated against, but even beyond not being discriminated against, feeling a sense of dignity in one's job and in one's life. And the last, but definitely not least, is commitment to larger projects. And I would say that these are transcendental projects, and I'm using projects here in sort of a moral philosophy kind of way, as a life project, something that we are committed to that goes beyond our own material self-interest. And those can be religious or social or political. Of course, well, I will lead. Well, I will say this: they're always made up, right? Unless you're religious, and all respect, that is the case. If you're not a religious person, however, our transcendental projects always are social creations, and yet if we see them as social creations, they lose their power, which is kind of a paradox. Oops. Okay. So the most widely used and recognized multidimensional measure is the UNDP's Human Development Index, which combines income, education, and health. Now, these are all pretty gross indicators, right? Years of schooling, but what sort of schooling? What are we schooling people for? This is, it varies. But there are great data sets for these. And that's part of the appeal, right? Is when we're coming up with aggregate measures, we have to be able to get the data. And so again, it's this compromise between what we want to do, a robust multidimensional measure, and the sorts of data that are available. Now, the Oxford OP, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Index, identified early on in their work 5 missing dimensions. And this was very important for me. I collaborated a bit with James Foster and Sabina Alkira and the folks over at OP. And I was really enchanted by their 5 missing dimensions. And those are, I've put them up here on the left, employment quality, not just employment, but the quality of employment, empowerment, having effective agency to realize change in the world, physical safety, the ability to go about without shame, using measures of stigma and discrimination, social connectivity, and last, psychological and subjective well-being. super cool, right? They're critiquing the HDI. They're saying these are the dimensions that are missing that are really important for people's lives, and I would agree with those. And yet, several years later, when they actually have the funding to start doing this and integrating this into global measures, what we see on the right is the current constitution of their multidimensional poverty index. And you'll note that it's not that different than the HDI, right? It's health, education, and material living standards. They've broken those down in some cool and interesting ways so that I think that they get better data. But nonetheless, I would say that the initial promise of including these 5 missing dimensions broke down in the practice of trying to access the data and large surveys. So there's lots of cool work going on around measurement these days, and OP is doing a lot of that, and we heard from Talita and Kuhn also doing really interesting stuff. But as a cultural anthropologist, as a qualitative researcher, I'm always worried about, what gets left out of any measure. What are we missing in that? And how can we get it less wrong going forward? We depend on metrics, on numerical metrics, but it's important for us to keep in mind that these are always imperfect, and we shouldn't fetishize any particular set of indicators. So what does get left out, and how can we integrate qualitative data and lived experience and the interconnection between these domains? One approach, and I'm not really going to go into this today because it's very hard to operationalize, but one approach comes from Latin America, and the movement that's called there in Spanish Buen Vivir, good life, as it would be translated into English, or Sumac Causai, which is the Quechua word. And this indigenous perspective on well-being offers an even more radical alternative to the HDI and the MDI that tries to integrate economic and social and cultural and environmental and spiritual factors into an understanding of what the good life is. I think it's really cool. Again, the efforts to operationalize this have been not super successful, but it points the way of looking at different things. Okay, and now I want to talk a little bit about my German data and how qualitative research can be integrated into quantitative research. The discussion yesterday ended talking about preferences and how we get at preferences. And Kuhn mentioned the distinction between stated and revealed preferences. Stated preferences being the crazy things that people say they want, and revealed preferences being what people actually do when they reveal what is considered largely, at least within economics, their true preferences, their real preferences, right? And the idea is that when the rubber hits the road, when the cash changes hands, people reveal their true preferences. And whatever they may say, what does that matter? And I'm going to argue for a rebalancing of the relationship between stated and revealed preferences. I don't know if everybody here is based in Germany or not, but those of you who are familiar probably with the labeling regime on eggs. This started in 2004 with an EU directive. On the left-hand side, you see a placard from that photo was probably taken in 2015 or 2016. Back when there were 3 different categories of types of eggs, 4 different categories going from 0 to 3. 0 being green. I've been blanking on the English word right now, like eco eggs, right? Like green, ecologically friendly egg, organic eggs, and free range. 1 being free range, 1 being cage free, and 3 being battery caged, which were sometimes back in the day called Kazet Aya. because of the battery cage. Germany outlawed battery caged eggs a few years back, and so now on the right you see the new form. Okay, I'm building this up because when I started doing my research in Germany, actually I was going to study the Mitbestimmung process at Volkswagen, and this was right when the big scandal, those of you who are old enough to remember, emerged with the work councils there. And so I switched my project and started looking at supermarket consumers, and I was fascinated by the eggs because for an economic anthropologist, a cultural anthropologist who studies political economy, I saw this as a wonderful natural experiment where people were having to make a moral decision every time that they purchased eggs with a price equivalent to that moral decision attached to it. And so here's a chart. Again, this was at an Edeka in Südstadt, Hanover. We did surveys there, and we were asking people what kind of eggs they bought as they walked into the supermarket. These were fairly medium extensive surveys. They probably took 15 minutes. I mean, pretty long for a sidewalk survey. And we would ask them the reasons why and so forth. So what you see here, this is dated. This is 10 years old, but nonetheless, that 26.5% of respondents reported buying the best, the morally best eggs, the organic and free range. 33% the free range eggs. And on the right hand side, you can see the price difference, which is significant between these different kinds of eggs. And so again, I was super excited to find this because I saw the numerical code as being an indicator of what I call moral provenance, the sort of the moral value chain from which products emerged. And then we had this price comparison along with it. And it was reporting that people were willing to pay significant prices to pursue their moral projects, their larger projects, right? That tie into their identity of seeing themselves as being a particular kind of person. Let's see, what did I do here? Let's go back to this. I thought I was going to get through this without a technological glitch, and there we are. Okay, but look at this. I was able to get sales data from the store. And so look at the difference between what people were reporting having purchased and what they actually purchased. It's really significant. And sort of surprising. And when I first ran this data, I was like, wow, this is great. It's like one of those gotcha moments, right? Like gotcha consumers who were lying to me in the surveys. I can double check what you're actually doing. But the more I started thinking about this, the more I started thinking about the relationship between stated and revealed preferences. And my thought, my analysis of this is that we should not totally discount the stated preferences as just being lying to a surveyor. And sure, some of that was probably going on. But I think that there was also, and this shows up in the open-ended answer in the survey, there was also a sincere desire to pursue a larger pro-social project. And that the respondents were seeing this as something that was important. But when you go in and you're about to, you've got the kid in the grocery cart and you're about to go to the checkout line and you're thinking about, do you really want to pay a couple of euros more for your eggs when you've already bought all this other stuff that's going to be really expensive as well? It kind of triggers a different cognitive frame, right? When you're there and you've got the cash in hand and you're trying to make the decision. But I think that does not undermine that people might want to live in a society where all of the eggs were organic and free range. But it's hard for them to make that decision in the moment. And perhaps, actually, going back to this, the policy response to that is to take battery cage, the worst sort of battery cages are just those tiny little cages that the chickens are scrunched into. The policy move here was to take battery caged eggs off the table. It's kind of nudging, right, in a way, or it's more than nudging. I guess it's whatever the next level up from nudging is, but like, throwing your ashtrays out so that you don't smoke or whatever it is, sort of taking that option off of the table. And so perhaps there is a case that our stated preferences can be true and real, and yet require some sort of coordinated action to be able to realize those. And we can think about this in our daily lives as well, right? It's like, do I want to eat that croissant, or do I want to lose a little bit of weight? I actually want to do both of those things, and I'm having to make calculations on what I want to do at the time. But if the croissant was off the table, that case would be easier. So the case presented here, I would suggest, argues that sometimes regulations and norms that reduce choice can act to protect common goods and potentially even improve overall well-being. And I think that is an argument for using qualitative data to understand quantitative data, to be to put real value on what people themselves say, and not assume that they're lying if what they say is, they may be lying, and that has to be on the table, but I would like to introduce as the possibility that they are not, and that they want two things at once in different ways. And finally, the importance of a commitment to larger projects. And here, the survey results, people didn't have a clear idea of what they were saying that they were supporting by buying cage-free eggs, but it was a vague notion of they must be better. Workers are probably better paid. This is better for the environment. So it was this vague sense of a greater good that they were pursuing that seemed to be important. And that's it. 35 minutes, is that right, Daniela?
Perfect. That was, yeah, great timing. Thank you very much, Ted, for this great presentation. I'm going to open the floor for questions, and I need to open. Okay, I think the first hand was from Professor Norbert Hirschauer. Please.
Hello, Ted. Well, thank you very much. Very interesting. I like the egg example. I think there's more in it than what you actually said. In my teaching, I'm an economist, and economists don't like stated preferences, as you said. But I always say, well, whenever there is a substantial degree of bounded rationality in a decision making, then we cannot trust what people choose as revealing their preferences. And I'm just trying to think about your eggs again. Could there be also some degree of bounded rationality? And then the bounded rationality argument would be the overarching element.
Great point. I think you're absolutely right that is going on here, bounded rationality. So again, when I was conducting this survey 10 years ago, 88% of people were paying cash in the supermarket there. And I think that cash, and I think that there's some evidence for this, sort of that cash transaction invokes a certain rationality frame. Which ties into this idea of bounded rationality. So yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next is Antje, please.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation, Ted. I have a question regarding the question actually you had to your respondents. I mean, how was the question exactly stated. So was it just what would you like to buy, what kind of eggs, or did you give a bigger context? Imagine you have like this income, you have this and blah, 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 blah. So because I think when I was being asked, so would you like to, you know, like contribute to the bigger project? I would say yes, definitely. But my family, my income, whatever stops me from doing this. So if I get like good stated preferences, if I want to have that, then maybe I should give like a bigger context in the question.
That's a great point, and we didn't and should have. I like that framing of it. We were just asking, what kind of eggs do you buy? And we asked it in a like a regular kind of way, like what kind of eggs do you buy? But you're absolutely right that I like your framing of different possibilities that they could have said. And of course, income makes a difference. You know, like right now, 20 years ago, I would have been really concerned with the extra euro and eggs, and now I'm at a point in my life where I'm not really that concerned about it, and so I would say that that's probably true for many people. So yeah, that's thank you. That's good.
Next is Peter Krause.
Thanks, Ted. I have a brief question to the first part of your, you mentioned the aspirational horizons. And so you made a strong point. So you put it also together with this opportunity and whatever. I'm quite familiar with the measurement framework of the MPI, and you can also use it for positive well-beings or capabilities as we ever want to try it. My question is when regarding the issue of aspirations, do you have any suggestions how to catch it empirically? Because it is, my impression was it is quite often used as an argument, but it's hardly catched in that context as and which what is the meaning in this multidimensional well-being frame? Thanks.
Great point. Really great point. And you're absolutely right. People have been talking about aspirations, very little operationalized in the field. We tried to do it in a survey in Mozambique some years back as a monitoring and evaluation of a UN program empowering women. And we were able to do pre and post empowerment seminar surveys about what they wanted out of life. It was difficult. It was difficult to come up with, and I'm not really sure about working it into larger multidimensional measures. But one interesting thing came out of this, and this is to your point that I want to mention, is that we found that well-being, 6 months after going through these empowerment workshops, well-being significantly decreased among the women who participated. And our analysis of that was, and then playing on sin, we called it frustrated freedom. Aspirational horizons were increased through these workshops, right? You can do everything that a man can, and all these professions that we've only assumed that men can do, they're open to everybody, and you should have an equal voice in your household and things like that. And then the reality of not being able to realize any of that stuff actually reduced well-being. And so, I mean, paradoxically, expanding horizons and yet decreasing self-reported well-being.
Next is again Norbert Hirschauer, please.
I must have missed one major point. Why do we look for an index? What is it good for? And you mentioned Amartya Sen, and you see in the chat, well, maybe it's not correct, but you see a formulation of what capabilities are in Amartya Sen's sense. So it's people's factual freedoms of choice, you know, and their potential to achieve outcomes which are valuable to them. So I quite like this definition and this approach by Sen. And if I took that as the starting point, I would claim that a good index needs to measure exactly these freedoms of choice to achieve valuable outcomes for that individual person. And I'm not actually very familiar with those many different, I've heard about them and I know them a little bit, but I'm not very familiar with those different indexes which have been proposed. But which one would come closest to you know, to trying to measure this? And would you suggest that maybe that Antje in her endeavors follows the approach and tries to develop an index which actually measures that less less incorrectly than others?
I'm with you. Yes, I also like that definition. And as you're familiar, a lot of work has been done following Sen's definition. This definition of what's the difference between subjective agency and effective agency. He sort of combines them in this, and that's what that Mozambique example was kind of getting at. I think you're absolutely right that it should measure capabilities and freedom of choice. It is still very individualistically based. It is, you know, individual's choice, and I think that we have had a difficult time trying to work out what might be called collective agency and collective capabilities. That very often agency is realized as the convergence of different forces in a particular context, rather than as an innate autochthonous, you know, characteristic of an individual. And that makes it tough for coming up with any kind of index, right? If it's contextually dependent, how do we come up with a transcendent number to capture that? And I don't have an easy answer. Will say, and again, as you're probably aware, the OP group is kind of Sen's designated, you know, that's the group that is supposed to operationalize Sen's along with the HDI, Sen's framework. But they keep running up against this wall of the kind of data that they're able to.
Thank you. Next is Thomas Herzfeld, please.
Yeah, thank you. But I saw Norbert still talking without opening his microphone. I don't know whether that's still adding to this or not.
May I ask one specific question regarding that? I mean, Amartya Sen also cautioned that we shouldn't take it too seriously if a subdued wife or a slave worker is quite happy with her or his life. So basically, when we take that serious, we try to measure that Sen capability approach. Don't we need to be honest about that? Don't we need some kind of paternalistic approach? Because then I say you are a slave worker, and if you are happy and you feel that it is perfectly—
Yes, some sort of paternalistic approach. Yeah, I know. I wrestle with this, and I don't have an easy answer. Is everybody frozen?
You're frozen.
I think your camera or your internet connection in my. Okay, now you're. Can you say something?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think I caught that question, and you're absolutely right. The paternalistic approach. Do we need some sort of? And I wrestle with this, and I don't have an answer. But thank you for bringing that up, because yeah, on the one hand, the Latin American example, slaves or subdued wives. You know, how much can we trust their subjective well-being on that? At the same time, it does seem overly paternalistic if we decide what the capabilities should be. So there has to be some sort of back and forth, I think, there between the subjective understanding and the collective. I mean, we have decided health, I think, is pretty solid. Everybody around the world would rather be healthy than not. Education actually is a little bit more problematic in weird kinds of ways, right? We all sort of think of education as an innate value. It does take children away from community kinds of learning very often. It can replace traditional knowledge with Western knowledge that may or may not be of benefit in a particular setting. And so I think we all, I totally, Norbert, thank you so much for these questions, because I agree with you, but I don't have answers on them. I think we have to be self-critical about our basic categories as well, like with education. And I know, and I hope that you're going to weigh in at some point here, Valerio, because I know that you've been working on some of these issues as well.
Okay, no, thank you. I just step in with my question, and maybe I'm going already one step too far. So your Mozambique example reminded me of one part of this project dealing with Eastern Germany, and there we have very nice mirror. Yeah, that in '89, early '90s, aspirations were extremely high, and after people realized what is the reality of a market economy, what does it mean if you have competition, bankruptcy of firms, inefficient firms, and so forth, we had tremendous decline in support. Let's frame it like this, yeah. And we have even now this huge debate about these political sentiments and satisfaction with democracy. Even the question is, can we? This challenges subjective measurements. First, that would be one conclusion, and the second point is, in how far are these subjective measures useful to formulate policy recommendations? Or should we just say policy recommendations can only be based on objective measures? So that's some sort of dilemma I see, but I'm not sure whether you have an answer to this.
I don't have the comparison with East Germany is really good. That's a great, yeah, you're absolutely right. That it's parallels in Mozambique example. I share your concern, and I don't have an easy, and I wish I did. I don't really have an answer. On the one hand, I want to say, I mean, that people's self-conceptions of their position in life is important, but we have to contextualize it in the ways that you're saying. But when we promote certain capabilities, we're already predetermining what we think their good life should be. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of a conundrum.
Thanks. Next is Kelsey.
Yes, hello, thanks. So I'm going back to your egg example and thinking about the difference between what they purchased and what they said they want. And it sounds to me like social desirability bias. However, you're reading into it a bit more, and I think that that's quite interesting. So it seems like it could be broken into the desire to conform to a social norm versus signaling that they're conforming to a social norm, and also preferences for a better world. So I'm wondering if you think that, and part of what you were referencing was this preference for a better world, which I like and hadn't thought about before. So, in your head, did I get it right? Yes. Would it be possible to separate these things out? And then do you think that there's, some power in influencing social norms, maybe, and how do we do that?
Yeah, great observation, and very diplomatic there when you said that my analysis is interesting. Yeah, I think you're right. I think all of those things are going on there. And I guess that's kind of my point, is that it's both and rather than either or, right? Or they, yeah. And yes, and again, we're all dancing around the same issue. Do we, what is the role of policymakers? Have to have a future that they're going toward, and that future is going to be impositional to some degree on the people that are affected. And then how do you work that out? I liked your comment in the section, sort of the public consultations. I think are a great way of doing that. And Kuhn yesterday and OP has played around with having focus groups do weighting of variables and things like that. I think that that's important. It occurs to me, though, again, I'm still a little bothered by the individuality of preferences. And you were putting it in terms of sort of social ideals, and I think that that's right. And I wonder if maybe public consultations in kind of a John Rawls kind of way. So, not what do you want out of your life, but what sort of society would
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, what kind of life would you think is good for others? I actually, it came up in another seminar recently, and I forget the exact context, so I think it's really spot on. What kind of world would you want to live in the John Rawlsian sense? Because that addresses ethical concerns, I feel like, in a much better way.
And the ethics are important. The ethics are important. Yeah, maybe people weren't buying as many Yuko eggs as they should have, but I still want to believe that the ethics and the transcendental project are important.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next was Stefan Brosik.
Yeah, hello. I also liked it. I'm not, but I find it interesting, and I see clearly that this neither the stated nor stated preferences nor observed choices are very telling about how people's well-being is. One big area of reasons is also that people have a lot of myths and false beliefs and brainwashing by advertising, all these things that say, yes, let's say buy a lot. I go to vacation oftentimes because there is so much they hear a good vacation gives you some what is that, recreation and things like that. There is a big discussion about animal welfare, and that some people look how big is the place for the animal and how cold is and everything. And there is another line of reasoning. People say we just look at the animal's health, and this is the very indicator that indicates whether their living conditions are acceptable or not. I have not. I cannot derive a very clear suggestion for how to measure people's welfare, because these subtle and aspects of health can never be collected in a survey, but at least when we come up with a survey, when we come up with an index, I think it may be a good way to validate it by seeing how well it correlates with diseases that are health outcomes that are likely to be related to well-being. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, thank you. That's really fascinating. And I love the sort of looking for pet treatment as the signal for overall sort of societal well-being. You pointed to a great point one of the things that I emphasized was commitment to a larger project that is beyond us. When I say that, the first place our minds goes is to pro-social projects. and what we would consider to be positive projects. But of course, the data are really clear on this, that commitment to things that we would this depends on what your stance on religion is, but religious people have much higher levels of well-being. I would tie that to their belief in being involved in something that is going to transcend their lifetimes. But the same is true, as you said, for marketing campaigns and others. We create those. Now, there is a formula for, you know, authoritarianism or for different kinds of political projects to manipulate people. But if we're trying to reflect what people want, yeah, it's.
Valerio Simoni, please.
Yes, hi. Thanks a lot, Ted. It was nice hearing you again, and I really appreciated the presentation. I'm aware that you have been discussing these issues before, so I missed that part, but I wanted just to add some examples or reflections on the thing you mentioned of the example of Mozambique, you know, frustrated freedom. It made me think of this whole idea of cruel optimism, which Laurent Berlin brings up, which is precisely this optimism, these people looking for aspiring to a certain life to which they cannot access it, which then creates frustration and more suffering, actually. So it's very tricky. I mean, and the work I'm doing, it's in Cuba, where I was working with people returning to live in Cuba and trying to push for another idea of a simpler life. You know, well, I migrated. You people here in Cuba think that outside it's all great, but actually I went through a lot of difficulties. Life here is not bad, which should have other criteria to judge our well-being. But these discourses didn't go down well. You know, people were simply not up for it because there are this more dominant narrative that push for another kind of well-being, which is based on purchasing power, material wealth, and nowadays people are fleeing from Cuba, and here it ties in with something you mentioned, Ted, which was about the social media, and this is something I started looking at because the people in Cuba are being bombarded currently by messages from Florida, from the United States, from Cubans about the American dream, you know, quite literally. And so I'm seeing friends in Cuba spending $10,000 to cross all Central America, to go to the United States and live a life which I considered quite good in a rural area of Cuba, to then end up working in a mobile phone shop in Florida 12 hours a day for 7 days a week. And well, their choice was determined by the hammering of some message that basically your life is not good and it could be so much better in the United States in this case. So this is really about, well, I repeat some of the considerations you already made because I think they are so important. So and it's an issue of power also. Who sends the message? How is one able to push for a certain message and the impact that it has, and in the sense the vision of what's a good life that's being pushed for, and how we can change people's lives, how we can create much frustration and actually suffering. It was a bit disjointed, but I just wanted to jump in and say something based on
Thanks so much for that.
My work and the conversations we had earlier also with Ted.
And I would just mention to Anja and Daniela and the RuWell team that Valerio's work on migration and well-being in Cuba is something that would be directly relevant to y'all if you haven't seen it.
Thanks a lot for the recommendation. And I would also like to jump in a bit. Now we're basically a bit over the schedule, but if everyone agrees, we still have 2 raised hands. If everyone agrees, we can take another 5 to maximum 10 minutes, at least. Yeah, here it's 2:05, and I would say maybe 5:10 maximum, if you can ask brief questions.
And that works for me. And let me just mention briefly, Kelsey, yeah, you're absolutely right. The meaning stuff is very, it's the same or very close, and very nice, nice connection there. And Norbert, thanks so much for the Bach quote there, which I like a lot. He's a little optimistic maybe, but I like the sentiment.
May I jump in here? Now, this is really a question I'm battling with. I mean, on the one side, we have Borg, and he is really very enthusiastic about the potential of happiness research to inform policymakers. Because it's interesting, we seem to jump into formulations like we, and then the we is the government and sort of, you know, but, you know, we are talking basically about informing policymakers who we presume to be honest representatives of the people by some index of happiness. And let me take the role of advocatus diaboli. I would argue that Borg is perfect, is not right. It's perfect nonsense what he says. You know, taking people's happiness as a line for to inform me what we should do, you know, what kind of rules we should introduce into capitalism to make it livable and a good life for everybody. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me as an economist, not at all. And now the question is, okay, he may be overly optimistic because he made this statement with regard to the simple answer to the question, how satisfied are you with life as a whole or whatever. But now you are developing an index. So my criticism of Borg, are you confident that it doesn't hold for the index? It would hold for Borg and a simple question, but not for your index.
Yeah, I think that is, yeah, I think that that's right. I'm probably somewhere in between you and Bach. I do, there is value in politicians pursuing happiness or well-being. No, I agree. And I don't know, yeah.
Antje, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I have a quick question, actually. So we talked a lot about objective and subjective data, and that we should include those data in when developing an index. But when we talk about subjective data, we talk more about preferences. But what I was thinking and wondering a lot when I think about data and what we should actually conduct in surveys, what about perceptions of the world? I mean, when we talk about subjective data, so what about if perception differs from reality, and how serious should we take those perceptions? I mean, about inequality, for example, you have like perception of inequality that is super high in Hungary, for example, and Hungary is the country with the lowest income inequality. And people get angry and, oh, it's unfair and society is unfair and blah, blah, blah. So how should we deal with that, and how seriously should we take it? I mean, I don't know. I don't expect an answer to this, actually, but I just want to raise it here that this strikes me. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I don't know. Although it always, again, it comes back to this thing of when you puncture people's beliefs, there's a normative policy behind that, right? And so are we, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. But I like the idea of the perception being different than the reality, and that we have to grapple with that. We have to grapple with that.
Too bad that you don't know, but thank you anyway.
We're all expecting you to figure this stuff out. And
We
then
will.
we're going to have this meeting again in a year, and we're going to all say, oh.
We will. We have four more years, and then we will come up with the answer and get the Nobel Prize, all of us as a team.
Perfect. Well, I think that I've gotten more out of this session than probably you have. I really appreciate the questions, and I know that I didn't answer any of them very directly, but I don't know. You know, I'm a qualitative researcher. I like the questions as much as the answers, and it made me think about things in a different way. So I want to thank you all.
I would like to also say thank you. The discussion was very lively and informative and helpful for us. And now that we're on this big quest with the project towards answering the biggest questions, I would like to close this event and wish you all a great rest of the day. And thank you a lot for your participation.